Hello, my name is Sabrina Denmon, and today I'll be telling you about the archival representation of women's mental health records in the Carl Albert Center Congressional Political Collections records. Over the last semester, I have been conducting a study of women's mental health records in congressional collections. I wanted to find out whether or not women's mental health records were represented, how they were represented, how the representations changed over time, and what formats these mental health records are preserved in. So when I talk about archival representation, I am referring to Elizabeth Yackel's 2006 definition of archival representation as the processes of arrangement, description, and the creation of finding aids and other tools, as well as their outputs. Now, this is particularly important because the way that archivists represent records in their collections directly determine the narratives for how they are represented in history and society. Because the way these records are represented influences whether or not researchers will use them and how they use them. When researchers use them to create things such as history, literature, news, journal articles, or other media, they are directly contributing to communal memory with those records. Now, in all archival collections, women's records have been particularly underrepresented, despite efforts since the 1970s to address that. And mental health records are particularly underrepresented, or they misrepresent the patients involved in horrible ways or in paternalistic ways, typically from the perspective of their doctors. Now, women's mental health records especially are particularly underrepresented. It's very problematic for marginalized groups especially, such as Black women, whose records have either not been kept or are not preserved well or are not represented well. Now, this is important because underrepresentation has some very negative impacts on the creation of identity and on mental health itself. For my study, I was looking at the Carl Albert Center Congressional and Political Collections, including the Julian P. Cancer Political Commercial Archive records. I pulled a sample of 243 finding aid entries for these records for women's mental health, and women's issues. For my data collection, I used keyword searching in the online finding aids on ArchiveSpace. I also went and accessed the older physical finding aids to compare those entries. For data analysis, I used thematic analysis and content analysis. The content analysis especially was looking at all instances of women mentioned in these records, such as she, her, hers, women, wife, etc. My results are still preliminary as I have not finished my final data analysis just yet, but I have found that the records of women's mental health are represented in the collection, and they are preserved in text, photographic, and audiovisual formats. Women's mental health records especially contain themes of responsibility and judgment. Responsibility referring to records containing themes of government oversight, assistance, or intervention, typically involving funding or reform. Judgment were records containing derogatory words indicating subjects as other or calling for action against these groups. By derogatory words, I mean instances such as mental retardation or homosexuality, which is a very clinical definition. And calling for action against typically involved for calling for investigations against these communities or actions to get rid of these communities. Now, women's issues were records relating to women's reproductive rights, civil rights, education, abortion, etc., which they all directly impact how women are represented, as well as women's mental health through their access to healthcare and such. Women's identities involved themes such as victim, voter, wife, or mother. By victim, I am referring to records portraying women as victims of either some outside force such as violence, domestic violence, or poverty, or they are victims of some internal force such as their own pride. When I refer to women as a voter, I'm referring to records containing themes of voting, such as political commercials or records that are involving actions to encourage people to vote or get involved in politics. Wife is because many records contained instances of women being referred to as Mrs. or so-and-so's wife or wife. Mother was because women were constantly referred in connection to infants, children, abortion, reproductive rights. This is often intertwined with the other themes of victim, voter, or wife, but there were enough instances that I kept it as a separate category. Now, vague records are records with problematic or missing scope and contents fields, dates, or extents fields. Typically, they either had no information in those fields or they had the collection or series-wide scope and contents, extent, or dates for those fields. Now, I did find that the finding aids and the entries in those finding aids for these records have drastically changed and improved over time, partly due to the introduction of XML and EAD standards, as well as just different arrangement of these collections over time. So in conclusion, I have found that women's mental health records are represented and they contain responsibility and judgment themes. Women's records often contain reform and civil rights themes, as well as portraying women as victims, voters, wives, or mothers. Their records were preserved in text, photographic, and audiovisual formats, and the finding aids did change and improve over time. Yes, there are still some issues in these finding aids, but I feel like with enough time and attention, they can be resolved. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a good day.